Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our insightful conversation, Championing Diversity, Empowering Women of Color as Coaches and Leaders. I'm Daisha McClam, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator for today's discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's discussion will underscore the crucial role of engaging women of color in coaching and leadership positions within the youth sports community, the historical and societal barriers that have limited access, and strategies or initiatives that create a culture of belonging for all women to engage. Before we delve into our discussion, let me introduce you to our esteemed panelists who bring a wealth of experience and insights to this table. To start, I would like to introduce Maria Lopez. Maria has over 18 plus years of tennis coaching experience at all game levels, with 12 of those years at a collegiate level. She has coached 5 conference titles and 2 NCAA national championship teams at the collegiate level. Currently, Maria is the Senior Director of Memberships and Inclusion at We Coach. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you.
Carolyn Sadeko is a sports relationship coach and the founder of Coach Capua Sports Consultants, LLC. She's also joining us as a certified athletic administrator, a spiritual coach, and a nature framework life coach. Welcome, Carolyn.
Yay, thanks to be here.
Coach Kat is joining us for today's discussion. She is a pioneering force in the soccer world, known for championing rights to play across the Middle East and igniting a women's soccer revolution in the region. She is the first American Iranian athlete to play soccer internationally and is the former head coach of the Iran U19 national team. Welcome, Coach Kat.
Hello.
And to round out our discussion, we have Dr. Akila Carter-Francique, who is joining us. She is the Dean of the School of Education, Health, and Human Services at Benedict College, where she examines issues of race, gender, and social class and their intersections with sports, education, and society. She is also the co-founder of Francique Sport and Education Consulting, LLC, with her husband. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Akila.
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. So let's kick off our conversation. Just to bring some context into the discussion, I really wanted to open up and give some opportunity for some of our attendees to learn more about our panelists. So opening up to everyone, can you tell us about your experiences personally playing sports? Specifically, when did you have your first woman as a coach? And if you did, was she a woman of color? And how did that experience influence your journey as an athlete? We can start with Maria and then work our way through all of our panelists.
Yeah, I don't think that I would be where I am, have the experiences, the opportunity to live in the United States and pursue the dream of not just playing sports at a high level, at a collegiate level, without sports. Everything that I have experienced, I can trace it back to me being an athlete. The skills that I learned, everything that I learned just growing up and, having really the opportunity to gain those experiences. As an immigrant of the United States who came here, not knowing how to speak English, that was my avenue to just, create community and create friendships and create people to be around me. So it really has shaped me to who I am. I unfortunately didn't have the opportunity to have a woman coach throughout my career, or a coach of color, period, which, looking back, I think it definitely impacted my experience when I went into coaching, and it definitely impacted my experience leaving the coaching profession as well. Just not being able to have that role model or some of the, I think, important pieces that, looking back, I think would have made a complete different experience for me as a coach.
Thank you, Maria. And I'm pretty sure that your experience is echoed throughout most people. They do not have that benefit of having a woman of color who's been influential in their sport experience, and it kind of shapes some of your opinions as you move forward. Carolyn, did you have a similar experience, or was yours a little different?
Oh, it was quite different. Although I too am an immigrant, most of my models for sports have been women. So I'm very grateful for that. My fourth grade athletic director was Sally Harrington, and her daughter, her adult daughter, was our PE teacher at our school. And so the models that I've had of women, specifically in sports, have been intergenerational within families. And also because I did work for 20 years in an all-girls Catholic high school, and I was schooled in parochial schools in San Francisco, were women who were nuns. So already in these communities of very powerful women in leadership, and a number of those women were also women of color who were the phys ed teachers, the basketball coaches in these spaces that I was hanging out in and being educated in. So I did see them often as models. And I'm also going to say women of color were also instrumental in the male coaches that I had. They often cited their mothers, their sisters in their experiences as coaches. And so that was already a mental model for me. That was really in close proximity.
I think that that's a blessing that it was normalized at such a young age that you were able to see these women as leaders, and also had men in your life who recognized the benefit of having women leadership in those spaces. So I think that that is a beautiful upbringing to enjoy. Coach Kat, is yours similar?
Almost. So my father, I'm a first generation Iranian American. My father was on the Iranian national swim team before the Islamic Revolution. So, I was raised in a very competitive and athletic family. My older sister, she was a big time swimmer, and I didn't like swimming that much, but my family ended up putting me in soccer because they're like, that was the only sport that drained my, very high levels of energy. But as I was getting older, I needed coaches from a very different level, because in the U.S. at that time, it wasn't it was competitive, but it was kind of very stagnant. Like if you were looking at international soccer, it's like as if they're dancing on the field. And I ended up finding a Afro-Brazilian coach, and so she actually would travel between Tulsa and Rio de Janeiro, and she taught me how, like, all my skills, anything that I know I was doing on the field. Everyone was like, wow, it looks like you're dancing on the field, but really you're just nutmegging everyone left and right. It was because of my Afro-Brazilian coach. But overall, to see at such a young age that female coaches can have that kind of impact, I mean, I wouldn't have known what it was going to be like without a female coach. But when I saw that type of diversity, and I also, I come from a diverse background, but just to see that it can be played at the international stage and it's a lot higher in level, that kind of gave me that comfort that I can also reach those stages later on in life.
I love that the introduction to new culture actually was able to push you to your next level of sport, and that oftentimes is thing that experience that change of diversity really allows us to unlock new levels, both in our personal development as well as sports development. So this is we're off to a great start, guys. Dr. Akila, have you had some really great experiences in regards to having some women leadership in your sport life as a young athlete?
Well, my entree into sport, a little bit different as well. In some ways, I would say sport saved my life. I'm asthmatic. And so I remember the physicians, they told my parents one way to help me learn how to sort of regulate my breathing and control those things when an asthma attack comes on is to get me involved in sport. And so track and field is what I took hold to. I followed right after my big brother, I should say. He's 5 years older than me. And my parents figured we're at the track meet. She's running around anyway. Let's just put her in an event and see how that works out. And so track was something I was introduced to first. And then I ended up down the road, kind of coming back to track and field. As far as coaches and experiences, I love everything about track. Particularly it's Olympic year, it's Olympic season. And so my first coaches, though, were male coaches in youth sport programs, in middle school. I think in high school, middle school, I'd say I had my female coach was a volleyball coach. And then again in high school, I had another woman coach in volleyball and track and field, Coach Kopfer, shout out, with that. And so that was very helpful, but I guess I didn't let that sway me one way or the other. I just love being involved in sports. I had a lot of young women around me, and so that was very helpful. And I would say, as far as sort of guiding me in that path, while I didn't have that coach, but I did have a strong cheerleader and proponent in my mother. And so she was at competitions, you know, making sure I had food, but making sure to care for my emotions while I was there. So between her, you know, my godmother, my grandmother being an athlete as well, who's her mom, those were some women that really sort of kept me. And then I know we'll probably get into it later, but there were athletes out there that I also saw on television that sort of served as some of those role models to help me understand that I could be in this space.
And I appreciate how you can latch onto that legacy and those larger role models that we may not be able to touch them in the community, but they felt very approachable. I know exactly what you're talking about. Growing up watching the Olympics, you felt like those were your people. So yes, I love that you were able to connect with that. And feel free to stay off of mute because I'm going to go right back to you for our next question. But thinking about your current roles and the path that you've taken in your career, what has inspired you to take that path that's led you to where you are now?
Ooh, I think there's been many things along the way. I think, you know, of course, being an athlete myself, growing up in a sports space, competing at the collegiate level at University of Houston, having those teammates surround me. But I think, you know, more of it sort of poured into my direction as a student athlete at University of Houston. I got the great opportunity to serve as a peer mentor, to be in spaces where we did community service, where I was a member of our student athletic advisory board. And so getting involved in different community initiatives and initiatives where we work with youth really helped me sort of understand, oh, this is a cool space. Now, I will say I spent a whole 9 months in K-12 education, and well, my parents are great at that. They're K-12 educators. You have to have a gift to do that. But while in that space, I did spend some time coaching cross country. I coached in the track and field space, but I soon learned that the college level was probably where I need to be as far as engagement, and navigated over into sort of a campus rec space. So still sort of that health and wellness is sort of a through line for me, and being engaged in those spaces. But I had the great opportunity as I work full-time in campus recreation, as well as getting my graduate degrees in kinesiology, as well as my PhD in sports studies, to work with the athletic department, to work with leadership initiatives on campus, to work with the diversity, what was then the diversity office, and be able to be a part of different initiatives. And then ultimately completing my doctorate and working with my major professor and finding that our stories weren't there. And what I mean by our, I mean women of color in literature being examined, bringing those stories to life, those lived experiences, and seeing the absence of them, the invisibility of them, or almost omission of us was something that really bothered me, because I'm like, well, I know I ran, and I know about FloJo and Jackie Joyner-Kersee and Wilma Rudolph and Wyoming Attias and Cheryl Miller and Cheryl Swoops, you know, so where are our stories? And so I think a lot of that gave me that inspiration. And then as I've stepped into my professional space as an academic, my largest and number one muse is my daughter. You know, she was my firstborn. She was the reason why. She is the reason why I think I do what I do. I want a better space for her. I want her to know that she matters and that she can do anything that she wants to do. And she's 12 now, and she's definitely falling into place and being a leader in everything that she does. So she is my number one inspiration.
Thank you. And I really believe in all those inspirations. They actually like you develop new inspirations throughout life that continues to motivate you to move forward. Coach Kat, I know you mentioned there's some seeds at the beginning of you were looking around and saying like, we're on an international landscape. What are we doing here? And you started to connect yourself with new coaches. Is that what inspires you to then become a revolutionary in the soccer space? What was the next steps that got you to that level?
So Kat as a player is very different as Kat as a coach. I wanted to reach the highest levels in terms of my playing, but I never believed or thought or even had the goal of being a coach. It wasn't in me because I was not patient. I'm not patient at all. But what led me to this journey of mine was when I traveled to Iran for the first time when I was 17, and I noticed that there was zero infrastructure for women's soccer or let alone women's sports. And that wasn't just Iran, it was several countries in Central Asia and the Middle East. Once my playing career started taking off in that region, I got tapped on the shoulder by FIFA, and they're like, why don't you start coaching? We will sponsor you for your coaching education. And I initially turned down that offer because I was studying chemical engineering. We'll get into that later. But when I started doing my coaching education and going to like countries across the Middle East, coaching from like the grassroots level, like under 14 and under 16, I was realizing that these girls are, like their world is opening up to something completely different. They're coming from backgrounds where parents are actually against them being exposed outside of like their houses, and like they don't like them to be on the field. They don't like people like recording them or do any sorts of media. I mean, forget it. But then this whole like landscape started opening up that was all about women's rights, women's development in that region. And I put the helm on myself because I'm like, no other person has my experience to open this door. I'm going to spend just a couple, years doing this where we can build that foundation for women. Those couple years turned to almost 15 years of my life of just coaching and bringing in players from all walks of life. Like, for example, one of my best players who was my goalkeeper, 5'5", by the way, she comes from a family of shepherds, and I found her while I was hiking, and her like they were shepherding like these sheeps and goats, and she didn't have shoes, but she was carrying sheeps on her shoulder. And like, do you know, like, I mean, would you ever consider playing football? She's like, oh, I love, and she started naming all these players. And I'm like, okay, what position do you want to play? She'd be like, I would be an amazing goalkeeper. And I asked her, I'm like, can you throw a ball? She's like, throw a ball, I'll throw a rock really far away for you. So she ended up throwing this rock, and I'm like, okay, there's potential. There's a lot of potential here. And bringing a girl like her, from a family of shepherds onto, the field, that's a huge, it's change for her life, and for a lot of women in Iran. And then there's like these I don't know what you call it, maybe culturally, but then you have the Kurdish people that the fathers actually marry off their daughters at very, very young ages. And I'm like talking about 9-year-olds. And I met this 9-year-old, and her father refused for her to play soccer because he was like, oh, if I, give her to the highest bidder, I'm, saying goodbye to $60,000. And I was like, but if she comes and plays in the league, she will get paid that much per year for a very, very long time. So then it became like this whole like negotiation with parents. And then you had parents like, just take my daughter and go and make her into like the best like superstar. So I had all types of people that I had to, come across. But that inspired me to stay as a coach, because I knew that with my background from the US and what I was gaining internationally, that not many people would be put up to this task. And now I see that 2 million women play because of something we started back in 2005. So short answer, I never thought I would be a coach, but then I ended up seeing how much potential there is in a region, and I could do it, so I did it.
Thank you so much for not following a career in chemical engineering. On behalf of those 2 million women and the lives that you changed, thank you so much for choosing to be a coach, because it has made such a huge influential difference. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Carolyn, what was it that inspires you to take this direction in your career path?
Oh, everything revolves around me, I like to say, or I've been telling people around me. And for so long, the influences, I think, in the academic field, or for me, sports in general here in the United States, in our society, I've been trying to expand that. I think just because I'm an immigrant, because I'm a woman of color, and because so many expansive sorts of worldviews come into my life, and I want to integrate them all. So my background is in kinesiology, in sports coaching. Sports coaching paid my bills when I was a single parent, refereeing. All my jobs were in sports. And so my professional background was actually very instrumental in making sure that I could live in this society, to be honest. But what really drove me is this educational piece and this worldview from where I come, which is in the Philippines, and this collectivist worldview of what is sports, what sports as a team, what kind of specifically the culture that I come from is matriarchal and collectivist. And so those societal sorts of it's in my body, right? It's part of my lineage. And so when I'm trying to express myself in this society that I find myself in, we can do the transactional sort of aspirational things like this pathway to a profession. What does sports? How can we leverage sports to earn an income, to uplift our families and our communities? We can talk about it in that way, but we can also talk about what is it that sports serves in a much wider and broader and more expansive way. And that's the thing that gets me really excited when I think about ethnic studies, right? When I think about those sorts of ways to know each other in very different cultures and all of humanity in that way. What are the similarities through people of color? I will always, always, always prioritize and center people of color, women of color, Black women, especially because we are in a society that has systemically erased that. And so there is something in me when my purpose is to be Filipino 24/7. My family keeps asking, what the heck does that mean in terms of your salary? I'm like, I don't know, but I'm going to create something out of it, right? And sports gave me that. Sports gave me that pathway, not just to the mental access of what a team could be. The team is the collectivist group, right? And so sports gave that to me. So I'm just trying to leverage that in these ways in my current roles, even though it's really fluid still.
Even though it's still fluid, the perspective that you bring to sports is needed in more spaces. That collective, your lineage is a conversation that we need to bring more often, because the transactional clearly is not helping our youth. We need that type of community experience in sports. So continue to be Filipino 24/7, and we'll figure out the salary situation for your family later on.
Oh my gosh, I hope that doesn't mean that I expect to be paid in pesos, because the conversion is not very good.
And Maria, what have your experiences starting in tennis and then coaching at a collegiate level and brought you here? What has been the inspiration that has taken you over all of these accomplishments in your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think just like Carolyn mentioned, when I finished my collegiate career as an athlete, I also didn't see myself coaching. Coaching was something that I did at the beginning because it paid my bills. I was trying to figure out what I was gonna do, and in the process of paying my bills, it turned into this amazing experience, and found myself really getting excited about being around the development that I was having the opportunity to have with the athletes. I worked with little kids, little tiny from the grassroots level, worked at the junior level, and then had some experience, obviously majority of my career in the collegiate level, and some professional at the professional level. But as I was moving towards different levels of my career, what I noticed was that there was less and less people that looked like me. And, you know, I really didn't understand that until I could see it from the outside once I left the coaching career. And so about a couple of years ago, when I left, you know, collegiate coaching, I was kind of lost, right? Like, just like when we finished, you know, our athletic career, you just don't know what the next step is. I had spent almost 20 years with something that I loved, that I was very passionate about. That, you know, was filled with purpose every day. And I knew that whatever my next step was, I needed that. I knew that that's something that for me personally, I wanted to continue to make a difference. And I had just had the opportunity to attend our Women Coaches Academy at We Coach just a few months before my transition. And, you know, I was very lucky to get to know our, you know, our current CEO there at We Coach, Vanessa Fuchs, and we had some good conversations. She was checking in with me about, you know, what's after coaching. And, you know, we had some great conversations, and that turned into an opportunity to now, you know, be in the position where I am now, you know, at an organization that in my opinion, you know, does coaching, some kind of coaching. So I feel like I'm still doing my purpose, my passion, you know, trying to create change from the experiences. I was in the shoes of the coaches that are now, you know, out there living those experiences. And so for me, it is every day, you know, waking up with that same level of intention and purpose to create impact for the future generations of women coaches that, you know, get to do this for the next, you know, 100 years, so, or whatever long, right? So that has been my experience now.
Beautiful. And I'm already noticing a theme of everyone has inspirations from different people, but they mostly are from women of color that have been encouraging you to then be an inspiration for the next generation. So I am really excited about listening more to what you're experiencing. And to start specifically talking about our topic, Dr. Akila, what are the most significant benefits of women of color being represented in coaching and leadership positions in sports, particularly regarding personal development and empowerment?
The most significant benefit. Let me start with some statistics. I got to go that way. So if we think about 2020 was a big year, dual pandemics, COVID, Black Lives Matter movement, racial awakening for others. We were here. But I think one of the things to sort of think about in 2021 to 2022, if you look at college sport in particular, there were 399 Black women coaches. Now, this is in comparison to 3,760 white women, 5,236 white men. That's a number that we have to sort of take into context. Again, this is just from college sports. This is looking at D1, D2, and D3 combined. This is our representation. So the significance of, I would say, benefit of women of color being represented in coaching is to have or create an environment where it's normalized, where people are used to seeing us in these spaces and places, where the industry, organizations, coworkers, subordinates, athletes, parents, fans, community members, sponsors in the media, more importantly, are familiar with our presence. They're familiar with our personality. They know how to work with us on a regular basis, because for some reason we seem mythical in some ways, as if, you know, that notion of Black girl magic. We don't hurt, we don't have pain, we don't have emotion. And so by seeing us in this space on a regular basis across all platforms, or in coaching, when we talk about youth level, K-12 high school, club sport, Olympic sport, begins to normalize our presence. And I think begin to create a situation where we are seen, we are recognized, we are humanized. And I think more importantly, where people begin to understand and take note of our history and the fact that we have been here for over 100 years when we talk about coaching. When we think about our HBCUs, this is where I'm at. women coaches have been birthed out of this space. Programs, I will just say the Olympics has been sustained by our presence in sporting spaces in many ways when we talk about women of color. And so with that, sort of that understanding and that notion, we begin to create an opportunity to educate others about who we are, our history. But I think even creating a space of, well, you say normalization, if you will, it eventually equates to greater access, a greater sense of belonging in those spaces, opportunity for professional development, for training, for mentorship, a greater sense of self for ourselves, a sense of self-worth. And so all of those things can help sort of combat those notions of imposter syndrome that we may go through. At the end of the day, I would just say representation matters. So that benefit overall is representation matters, and it allows us to then continue to pour into the next generation so they can see themselves in this space.
Thank you. And looking at it from different perspectives, Carolyn, when you think of it from the grassroots perspective and the communities that you're engaged with, how do you think that it can benefit if we are very intentional about building this representation of women of color in either coaching or leadership roles? How do you think that we'll see the benefits in our communities?
Really specifically, I can go to any group and I could say, Dr. Aquila has just put this on. Here's all the data. Here's the work that Dr. Aquila has done. Here's the work that Maria and We Coach have done. What I do in my work is really try to attune folks, new coaches, families, spectators, community members, to the fact that, just like Dr. Aquila said, Black women, women of color have been here, and they continue to set the tone because, especially when we use the adage of sports as family, Black women, women of color have been taking those roles in underappreciated and under-recognized ways. So we just simply transfer that into the sports context. When Dr. Aquila, a few years ago, I'm going to see if you remember this, Dr. Aquila, when you did a presentation about family and sports during COVID and the impact of that. And that is the ecosystem that women of color, that Black women specifically bring, right? Collectivist societies bring to sports cultures. So when we expand sports cultures, and I would sometimes argue, maybe not here, but sometimes I think, like, if we do look at collectivist cultures that do matriate ecosystems, if we are matriating sports, that is a very different view than what we're used to here in the US, right? And so that sort of expansion, even of a mindset or even of exposure, is what's important when speaking as an Asian identified woman and coming from a colonized space, a colonized country, and having to perform my citizenship in America in a very specific way, and especially through sports. So the intersection of where sports goes into that is really a daily effort and a challenge, because that is in direct proximity to my own identity as a human being. So not just a human being who is playing sports or coaching sports or being in a sports environment, but a human being that has to bring all these various experiences because they interrelate in a way in our society where I'm being judged. And if I can bring kinship opportunities to these areas in our society, then that's a win-win for me. That's a win-win for everyone. And so again, those ways that women of color bring this mind shift in just their daily existence is something that I feel we shouldn't have to attune people to. People can also attune to us. It's not our full effort to bear. We can bear this collectively in our society.
Thank you. And that lived experience that you bring is exactly why we need more women of color to be in these spaces. So when our young ladies or young men are coming into spaces carrying multiple hats and multiple things that they are dealing with on a daily basis, in our sports spaces, there's a safe space. There's a space where they can be seen. And that only happens when we start to empower more women into these leadership roles so they can create those safe spaces from the lived understanding. Thank you. As trailblazers who have done some miraculous things from coaching standpoints, Coach Maria and Coach Kat, what unique barriers do women typically experience when accessing opportunities to coach or to just lead in sports spaces?
The whole thing is a barrier. But it's a barrier to be jumped over. It's a barrier to, everyone says that you need to push the threshold back, but it's a matter of just breaking that threshold and normalizing it. Female coaches, I mean, we have all the odds already against us. If we lose, oh, it's because she's a female coach. If there's like fighting again within your own team, it's because the female coach can't manage. So whether you do something good or bad, you're going to get the blame for it. So you might as well set up such a strong structure within your team and also educate yourself as a coach to, always be up to date with the new education that's coming in terms of your technique, your style, the psychology. I mean, you're putting on so many hats as a coach and as a female coach. And then again, I'm also representing the API community. And then as someone that's representing the API community, you have to be ultra sensitive to so many different objectives that how can you bring it all together? And bringing it all together is I won't consider it a barrier. It's a challenge for sure. But that's why we are, making huge strides in this space, because it's something that male coaches, I'm not saying they can't do, but they can't. It's not. We have the grit. They don't. And I think most of us here have a different type of background, whether it is the Black coaches community, the API coaches community, and then all of us having the common denominator as female coaches. We're always striving to become something a lot stronger, a lot better. We're challenging our opponents positively. And I think having that landscape is going to help all of us tremendously in the near future. But the fact that all of us decided that we want to be coaches is already, it's a huge step in the right direction.
I will add to what Kat said, just, a few of the things that not only do we hear our community of coaches give us feedback on, but also my own experiences as a coach. We can start with just a different type of biases that are, that you're going to experience, period. As a coach trying to enter the sports space, whether that's gender or racism bias, hiring biases. We do know that the majority of, male leaders are, making these hiring decisions to, whether they're going to have more female or more male coaches in their spaces. And there is some hiring biases. We hear all the time, well, women don't apply for these jobs. And we actually posted something not long ago for Women's History Month where, we were saying, well, when you're going after one of the, the best football coach, who you're targeting to try to bring to your school. You're going after that male coach. So why aren't we doing the same exact thing, for being more intentional about bringing more women coaches into our spaces? So I will say just, even just looking at what that hiring process is.
And it's a woman coach that they can control if they're going to hire her.
Yeah. I would also say like inequality in pay is something that we hear a lot. They're wanting to bring in, some more women coaches of color, but we're not paying them what they deserve to have. So, that's also something that could be a barrier. I think of safety and environment. We look at the state of our country right now, and places where coaches just aren't going to feel safe as a coach of color. I mean, we're just seeing it in the news happening with our athletes as well, right? Like there's just places in the US right now that we as people of color have to be very intentional if we're going to put ourselves in that position where there's not enough safety in the environment for us itself. And so the opportunities decrease if we're thinking if that's something that it's of value for us. And then I just a couple more, like the culture of the organization, how are they thinking about integrating people of color or women in their organization? Do they have a process or a path to help them be successful once they hire them? It's not just bringing them into their sports spaces, but do we actually have a plan to help them be successful, to help them navigate the challenges that they'll have if they're the unique, the only woman in the sports space that they're trying to navigate? And then I think one of the last ones that we experience as women, if you are trying to integrate your family as well, are we creating a space where there's policies in place to help the women who, are moms as well, who are trying to navigate some of the challenges of what that looks like with, whether that's time, being able to have their children around, being able to travel with our children if that's something that's that needs to happen, and how are we creating those policies around to support them, and making sure that it's not a barrier but an opportunity for them to enter the space.
Those are all really important topics and really important things that we should be looking at. And I noticed that Coach Kat, you mentioned there's so many hats that you have to wear in order to be successful. And then Maria, you started talking about how even getting into the space to even be recruited, the idea of being recruited is foreign as a woman of color to coach. But what, and I'm doubling back to you, Maria, because you already started answering the question, so let's just keep going with it. But what can organizations and leagues do to make coaching roles more accessible to women of color?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would say to start looking at your policies, like how are we hiring, how are we hiring women, or how are we hiring, period. And, being really intentional. If you don't have women in the department or in your space, in your organization, ask yourself why, right? As a leader of the organization, why do we not have women in the space? Is it the culture? Is it, the way our programs are? Like, how can we, and ask the women what they need. I think that's also super important, right? We forget sometimes that the easiest answer is just actually asking the women of color, what do you need from us? How can we make this environment better? So I think like looking at policies, asking the current people or the people that you want to hire, if you really want diversity, go after diversity, go find the diversity that you're looking for. And I think more important, create an onboarding plan that would actually help them continue that education, and not just, like I said earlier, just leave them in that spot and then, great, I check a box and I have someone of color in my department, or a female coach in my department. What does that look like? How can I help them? They might have unique challenges that I'm now going to have some support, a network of people that can help them be successful in that environment. And offering, development opportunities or funding or things that they can do to continue. If they don't have it internally, if they don't have a program in place, what else can they do outside that they can, really receive that information so that they continue to advance and retain, the position that they're in.
Beautiful. And once we've like kind of checked off some of those boxes of like, what does our recruitment look like? What does our onboarding look like? What is the pipeline? Carolyn, with your work with several organizations, what can they do to implement, what strategies can they implement in order to create a culture that is welcoming of women of color to take on these roles?
Oh gosh, I have two specific things. First of all, pay women of color consultants. Dr. Akila has a consultancy. I have a consultancy. There are other women of color who have consultancies in this sports space. What I've been seeing is this deference, right, to women of color. Okay, yeah, we'll change policies. And then who's going to write those policies? The women, the one woman of color or the two women of color already in that organization who are carrying that now as part of their job description that is outside of the job description that they were hired under. So it's this, again, this added effort, this added expertise that they are expected then to contribute if they are the ones who are going to improve the situation, right? So my remedy is simply looking into hiring people of color, women of color, to help an organization orient that way. So that way that the effort isn't already on the people who are going to operationalize it. So, and because that level of care is what we do already in our sports structures, right? We do that in other spaces. And so we're literally just going to apply it in these initiatives to improve and to respond much better to women of color in these ranks. So we can change the representation to be more equitable. So this equity piece really is very simple. Listen to Dr. Akila. That's what I like to say. So listen to women of color experts in this space, and then operationalize that. Don't expect them to operationalize it for you. Work with them to operationalize it for your organization. And some of that's going to cost some money. So that is the resource. That is the resource that women of color, we need to address that pay gap. We need to address the resource gap in those ways. And sports understands the concept of money as a resource. Women of color, we understand our own skill as a resource as well. So if a woman of color wants to negotiate, don't be surprised. Negotiation is something that we all can learn, is a skill that we all can share. And I would argue that also women of color need to be afforded that opportunity to be in those conversations.
And you touched on one thing: is investment is necessary. Organizations and leagues need to make a substantial investment, whether it's in the recruiting practices, as Maria mentioned, or in the hiring process, the interviews, or actually bringing in consultants to look at what the engagement looks like. But there has to be a level of investment. It doesn't happen just through wishful thinking. There
Right.
has to be something coming in from
Yes.
the league to support that. And
we're past the time and space where the data is required, right? People have done the research. Dr. Akila has that off the tip of her tongue, right? So that time of like people believing women of color, people believing, that time has passed. Get with it, people, and start operationalizing what women of color are instructing. That's what I would argue.
and
I don't want to argue, but I want to push that forward because this feeling of like, oh, we need more data, or oh, we need more rationale in order to put resources to that. No, give women of color who are already in these spaces, give them the money resource, give them the grants, remove those barriers so that we can operationalize this all together, because it is really important at this time.
truly is. And as someone who actually pushed through movement, Kat, you said it very quickly of women who will not move forward, who will just stay in the space and listen to what's given to them. But I can tell that is not something that you do. So in your experiences, what are some strategies or initiatives that can be adopted that will build more equitable pipelines to leadership?
Wow. So my experience is very much, developing country based, but I was able to bring a similar concept to the US. But in the US, we have a pay to play system. And it's like this world where, if you are paying to play, you kind of will have to play whether you are coming to training or not. Whereas like in developing countries that I was at, the level of competitiveness was a lot higher. So people were always showing up a lot more. They were competing at higher levels. But in order for women coaches to break those grounds and to like make these movements, you have to build a team. You have to build that trust. And without that community, you're not going to go anywhere solo. And that is one thing that I have learned from a very young age. And I learned it actually in track and field, where, you know, as Dr. Akila said, it's very much Black majority. And I was the only Iranian American on my track and field team. So, but I had my community behind me because they were very supportive. I might have not been the fastest one, but I had really good endurance and I could make it up in terms of, giving my 100% at all times. But I had the community, and that was the mindset that I had when I went to the Middle East and building, whenever I was there, yes, I was one of the youngest women to coach in that region, but everyone thought that was just going to be a one woman show. But I did have men on the team. I had women on the team. I had people who were 100 times smarter than me, but I knew how to manage, and you need to sharpen your management skills, and you need to never take anything personally. I think that was something that I had to learn, and I learned it in Malcolm Gladwell, all of his books. And just, people are going to have their good days, their bad days, their ups and downs, but you're just going to have to push through and understand that the bigger picture is a lot bigger than your current emotions, whether you're going through good times or bad times. But building on trust, having your people near you, being able to debate, negotiate, argue, fight, but in like obviously in a constricted zone fight, not throwing things at each other. But I think that has helped me succeed in so many different areas as a coach, as a player, and as someone that immigrated back to the U.S. And that's the kind of what I was able to take for myself and be able to share, because you cannot do it alone.
And I think that ties back to something Maria mentioned of it can't just be checking boxes. To actually build that community that can support a woman who is building her leadership levels throughout sports, there needs to be a community. And for like some of the
You're
smaller
selling yourself.
organizations.
Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, it's like you're selling yourself, and you have to prove to them that you're worthy. You have to show them that you can succeed. I mean, I was constantly giving them proposals, my annual plan, my weekly plan, and that the more friction there is, actually the best result will come out of it. So imagine like a sculptor, like he's constantly cracking through, or he or she's constantly cracking through the stones, but at the end it becomes this beautiful Michelangelo piece. So it's just a matter of finding the right people to come together to help you build that masterpiece.
And Dr. Akila, from your experiences and your research, are there any national initiatives that we can point to that are impacting the landscape of women coach and leading, and women in coaching spaces as well as in leading sports?
I would go back to barriers actually that we're facing. DEI is under attack. And, it's not to necessarily put a damper on the conversation, but that's the reality we're living in right now. So as much as we want to push forward in diversity and notions of inclusion and creating a level playing field when we talk about equity, we have to be mindful of how this legislation is playing a role on some of our organizations that are being funded to support initiatives that push women, promote women, amplify women and women of color in professional spaces, in sporting spaces. And so I think we first have to sort of acknowledge that reality, and then in acknowledging that, begin to think about what are ways that we can begin to come together, and pulling from Carolyn's notion of this collectivist mindset. It's a collectivist advocacy that we need to sort of push forward, collectivist activism that we need to do to step into these spaces and support programs like, yes, Women's Sports Foundation, yes, the Black Women's Sports Foundation. Think globally when we talk about IWG and Women in Sport, or Canadian Women in Sport. These are organizations that are working nationwide, if we will, and also globally to support women's initiatives, to create spaces and places where we can come into, gain, I don't necessarily want to say knowledge, because I think we're very smart individuals, but strategies and best practices for navigating these spaces and places that often put up these barriers, hurdles, cliffs, if we will, to be able to move through those spaces in a way that you have a community. I think of my amazing sister docs, those of us that are Black women sports scholars, that we, yes, work to do the research, but we're also in the trenches and working with organizations in golf, in tennis, in track and field, in bowling, in rugby, and let's not forget about our winter sports as well, but even our youth sport organizations like Laureate Sport for Good, who I work with, or Donna Callahan and Labs. These are organizations that work to support, yes, youth, those with disabilities, those of our LGBTQ plus population. It's a collectivist effort. You've got to find home and community and organizations that are already in, if I can say it, that we're already in the trenches and already forging a path. And so know that you don't have to do this by yourself. And so I think there's many initiatives out there, and the goal is to begin to work together to support one another so we can support one another in these spaces. But I think one of the things is, again, I use the words of Audre Lorde, is nobody lives a single access life. And so I might need to partner with Donna Callahan at Labs and my colleagues at Laureus and work with my athlete voices and those that can athletes that can amplify efforts that we do to work together. I also say, let's go back to, again, education. I'm in that school space. And I think that's one of the greatest things that we can do is educate or re-educate the miseducated about our history, to help them understand the social construction of gender, to help them understand how we have these controlling images of women of color, and to begin to work to disrupt and dismantle policies that have been here for a long time that come out of a space of male-dominated, white, structural spaces that often, again, going back to silence we as women, that make spaces where we're invisible. And so I think we really just, again, have to work together to identify the multiple initiatives that are out there, and then begin to work together as a collective, because we can support one another in these ways and support our individual athletes, our individual coaches, our leaders, and our scholars that are working towards this space of diversity, that are working towards this space of creating equitability and access, and hopefully get to a space where we have inclusion and we're seeing each other in these spaces, and our young girls are seeing that there's support there for them, because they're not the ones that have to necessarily be educated. It's others that have to be educated about us.
Thank you. Powerful, powerful words. And I would be remiss not to at least take a moment to acknowledge, Maria, there is some awesome work that you guys are doing over at We Coach, and that is having some impact across the nation. Can you just let us know a little bit about what is building and what partnerships you've built over the years to directly impact the number of women of color who are engaged in coaching?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for us as an organization, we're always looking at asking ourselves the question, like, how are we going to create change? And why aren't, just like any person in a leadership position, why aren't more women of color in the profession? And you mentioned the numbers, and we talked about the numbers at the beginning. As of a few years, we are at about 7% of women head coaches coaching women's sports. I mean, that number is so low when you think about the majority of, 41 or 42% is where we're at right now of women coaches, and then only 7% of those are women coaches of color. So when you think of that number, it's alarming to me. And so for us as an organization, we have to look inside and say, well, what is it? What can we do to make this, offer support, a network, resources, community, to our women coaches of color. And so what we started doing and a couple of years ago is that we ended up partnering and, you know, really going after funding to make sure that we could offer, you know, affordable access. But for what we ended up doing was for all of our HBCU schools or MSI institutions in the country, we used our funding to offer complimentary membership to every single one of them. And so we have over 950 coaches in our community that are now being sponsored by some of this grant funding. Our programs are we Amplify, which is a program specifically for women coaches of color that's always open to non-members. So we want to make sure that that there's not one thing that we haven't unturned to make sure that we make these spaces affordable, that we make them open and safe, and that they feel like no matter where you come from, whether you've been around our community or not, that you can just walk into this space and feel like this is a family, a place, a community, a resource for you. And so, we're always looking for ideas. I'm very passionate about this space because of that, because when I look at that 7%, it's alarming. It's alarming to see how low that number is, and the fact that we're not turning that number the other way around. And so, we can tie it back to representation and not having enough role models, and mentoring of other women coaches of color that maybe have walked that walk before, and how can we champion others that are coming, because when we look at participation, more women are participating in sports. So we know that number is increasing, but for some reason, the number of women coaches, especially the number of women coaches of color, hasn't. And so we need to really tie that together and really put the pieces together. So yeah, back to your question, the initiatives that we do, it's always having in mind, how can we create spaces that anyone, whether they've been around our organization or not, whether they're members or not, and how can we continue to create funding, whether that's for memberships, whether that's for our Women Coaches Academy, for any of our regional workshops, anything we can do to create funding and make sure that there's definitely representation of women coaches of color in our programs.
Thank you. This next question is a little bit of a free-for-all, so everyone take a moment and try and think of their answer. But thinking about your experiences, either in leadership roles or in coaching roles, in sports, you've all experienced and either jumped over or pushed out of the way many barriers in order to be successful. Kat likes to jump, and I think Carolyn likes to just bulldoze. So everyone approaches them differently. But thinking about all of those barriers, if you can go back and speak to yourself in your early years, what would the advice be if you were speaking to your younger self embarking on this space in sports? And how also with that, how have you kept yourself motivated in the face of all of these barriers? It was a good question, Dr. Akila. I know I was like, take a second and think, and then let me know what your thoughts are.
I can start. I know that I just spoke for a while, but I will say that, for a long time, and this comes from my background, as an immigrant, coming from a third world country, my family values, like for a long time, I was just putting my head down and working and putting my head down and working really hard and doing some really awesome things and not celebrating myself throughout my career. So if I could look back at my experience, I will say I wish I could have pulled more people with me and not put my head down, but put my head up and be really proud of those achievements. And while I was putting my head up, I probably could have seen a lot more people that needed more help, and I could have pulled them in and championed them in, and really, because I think that it was more of, you got to work hard. This is how you're gonna get the next job. This is how you're gonna go farther in your career. And yes, I think I did some of that on my own. But if I could look back, I wish my head was up so that I could have seen around me. I could have helped other people. I could have championed more women along the way.
I would like to tag along on this one, but mental health is only a recent revelation. And, when I was going between from the US to the Middle East, you're dealing with a lot of cross-cultural barriers, and like, they're intense differences as well. I mean, I got called every name in the book when I was traveling across the Middle East. And, as a 17, 18-year-old, hearing those hurtful things, and then, coming in that competitive landscape, the only thing you can do is just swallow it, just let it just sit with you. And it only came out like in the last couple of years, where you're going through, I don't want to call it depression, but you're going through like this emotional roller coaster, and you become really like the self-esteem goes like up and down all the time, because you never faced it when you were younger. So it's just now boiling out, because I actually have the time to think about it. But start your therapy as soon as possible, especially as an athlete, because being an athlete is so difficult. Like, yes, they are your teammates, but they're also going to be your competitors. Yes, your coach is going to pick on you, but you're just going to have to figure out how to, manage that terrain. Yes, you're going to be playing against like tough teams. You will lose, you will win, you will get, your butt kicked, you will get tackled, you will have so many emotions, but you need to understand that you need to look within as well. And I wish I had known that I could do therapy back when I did, instead of I mean, I love my family, but my family and my father was more of like, so what? You just have to like take it and, weather the storm, rather than like actually understanding the process and like thinking through everything. But yeah, mental health, everyone, now that there's so many tools and great teachers out there and counselors and therapists, please take advantage of that.
Ooh, I'm going to jump in there too. Then right off of that, Kat, is this creation or this emergence, right, of this ecosystem where we do see each other, right, where we are already connected. So the Filipino word that I use in my company is kapwa, which is this interconnectedness that we already have. And so it is bringing us back to our humanity, right? And instead of, like you say, Kat, like just taking it, deal with it, right? We're told that all the time by our society. Just deal with it, get over it, reflect on it, and then get over it. But what I want to offer, and I think what sports can offer, is how can we see each other in that? And I think women of color are already really good at that. How can we not just support one another? How can we literally narrate this experience with one another? So as teammates, how can we do that? And that way, we can bring that into the sporting spaces. We don't have to. I used to, when I was a beginning athletic director at the high school level, I used to have to go to bars, right? I used to pretend like I could hold my liquor and I could like be one of the guys, and I had to play that role, because that's where I was going to get some interaction with what I was going through. Um, Even though I have an identical twin sister who's also an educator, I always felt that I had someone along with me. So this response to being isolated, right? And especially for women of color, where our society already does that intentionally in some spaces. But how can we respond to that in a way that feels good for us culturally, from whatever culture we come from, what feels good to us, and then what already does exist, right? So if I can talk about sporting spaces in a coaching group, in an affinity group, then those spaces will have to exist, right? And how can we, as a sports ecosystem, make sure that that exists as a regular thing, not as extra, but as part of a role, part of your role in an organization, part of an organizational's capacity, that those already are in place, or that they are put into place. So that's what I see in taking Kat's mental health tip a little bit farther. How do we again operationalize that with centering women of color, without without having how do I say it? Without having to prove that we need it, right?
And so I'll I'll come in here. Advice I would give to my younger self. From an athletic perspective, I would say I had pretty positive experiences throughout competition and being a part of teams. But I think one of the things that really helped me, and I'm going to give a just shout out to my parents for this, is that they wanted to make sure that even in the recruiting season, that I had like a little document, a form, and I had to ask the coach questions and check boxes to make sure that they have my major and what is the program like and what are my opportunities for travel or, preparation. But I would take that same mindset into sort of my professional self. I would have done that better. And looking at, instead of, yes, you need to go to this type of institution to go teach, or you need to go to this organization to work because they're going to be the best outlet for you, the best space for you, begin to really do some self-reflection and understand who I am. And is this a good cultural fit for me? Is this a space that's going to champion me, to nurture me, to provide me a space where I feel like I belong? Because I've been in some environments that aren't so nurturing, that aren't so, ones that can champion me. One, because they don't understand I'm the first and I'm the only, and we've checked boxes here, but I haven't checked my boxes to make sure that I was centered in that dialogue. So I think that's one thing that I would say to myself. And I think it's something that is needed to really go back to what Kat was saying. From a mental health and wellness perspective, I felt alone many times. And yes, I was alone in reality in those spaces, but I needed to, much like we do with our teams, and even when our teammates, we spread across the country, I needed to tap into that network. I do it now, but it took a little bit of time because it was for a long time being in that space, being new in that community. It was made to seem as if I was the problem, that I didn't fit, that my scholarship wasn't worthy. But the reality was, I view my scholarship, I'm going to jump on Carolyn here. I see it as me search. I am investigating the lived experiences of myself with these young women, these coaches, these sport leaders, these administrators. And with that said, knowing that, yes, this work was of value. This work is of value, and it will continue to be of value. And so at the end of the day, begin to honor myself in that. So I would definitely speak to my younger self and say, utilize those sport skills, that recruitment effort. And when you look at those spaces and places that you desire to work in, know that there is a place for you. Just because this one is shiny or this is where everybody's going is not necessarily the place that's going to nurture your gifts and what you have to offer. So just to, again, honor you.
Thank you. Every single one of your answers were absolutely beautiful and exactly what we needed to hear. And I was very quick to say that was a great question because it was not a question I thought of. That came from one of our attendees. Thank you, Lucy, for inspiring that part of our conversation. But everything that you guys are saying, like, they tie together. Maria mentioned a few questions back, the concept of imposter syndrome popping up and making it very difficult to have a strong voice in these spaces. And that directly ties to a dehumanizing culture that doesn't censor us and that doesn't give space for us to receive mental health and to get a lot of feedback that isn't trying to build us up, but really looking for spaces. Or unfortunately, a lot of times we're the ones creating it. And learning how to have some community that can support you. So you don't have to have your head down because there's someone who's going to pick your chin up and make sure that you're looking around. So like really having those communities, that is how we succeed. I cannot believe how great this conversation is going. And part of me wants to just continue to go in this direction, but I have to make sure before we close out today that we take a moment to really talk about why this topic is important. Because what we do know, and we say it anecdotally, is that coach representation matters. Coach representation is necessary for girls' participation in sports. But I would love to hear from each of you briefly to talk about what it means to have a woman of color who's coaching. How does that directly impact girls' participation in sports? And because of the time, I think I'm going to specifically go to the people who I know are going to like quickly say some things. Dr. Keelan, I know you're in common statistics, and then Maria, I know this is your bread and butter. This is what you do. So if you guys can quickly talk about the effect that coach representation directly has on girls' participation in sports, I really want to make sure that we include that in our conversation today.
I'll try to be quick. Just to give a stat from the Women's Sports Foundation. They do some great research in that space, and I work with some amazing colleagues in that space. The last report, Black female athletes comprise 11% of female athletes, with less than 1% of female athletes being American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. Then you have 1.9% Asian, 4.3% Hispanic Latina, and 2.2% or more, two or more races. Those are some of our statistics when we talk about female athlete representation. Maria gave great statistics about what does that look like when we talk about coaches and then women of color coaches. So there's some disparity, there's some kinship in some of those things as well. And so, you know, with that said, representation is important. Representation is important, not only for sport participation, but I also want to bring back in that health and wellness when we talk about lifelong health. Because if we look on the other side from a health and wellness perspective, some of those highest percentages of obesity, of cancer, of even dealing from mental health and depression are for women of color as well. So representation, participation is important. Representation in moving through a sort of professional career is important. And that's many of the reasons that I'm sort of in my position now. Yes, I was running a sport institute, and that was a great opportunity, and it shined a light on so much when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusion, or lack of equity. And in my space now as a dean, I have the opportunity to work with amazing faculty and department chairs that are doing and bringing forth educational programs to not only educate our young people in psychology and social work and public health and sport management and even esports administration, but also to open the door and shine a light on, you can do more than just be an athlete. We are providing opportunities for them to know there's a spectrum of jobs, there's a range of careers that you can go into that may be coaching, they may be coaching adjacent, but they're in leadership spaces in sport, not only within the city, but also nationally, but also globally. And so that's one of the things that I love about being in this space now. And definitely, again, it drills back down to my own research of girls of color in sporting spaces. But that is why, you know, coaching can do one thing to be able to speak to that. But again, we have to have sort of that collectivist mindset to have Black female deans, Black female professors, Black female directors of organizations and leaders of tennis associations, if you will. And so those things are important because each of us, and I think I said this at the top of the show, is I saw these women on TV and they meant something. These young women now are seeing Dawn Staley. You know, yes, we had C. Vivian Stringer as well, but we have women in these high-level positions that we need to continue to amplify them. Those things matter. Those things are important. So our young girls can see, yes, you are here. Yes, you belong here. Yes, you can do this, and you will be supported.
I think you said it all. We go back to that motto of, we can be what we don't see. And, whether we want to talk about this or not, our women athletes, the young women athletes that get to participate in sports are going to become leaders in some space, right? Whether that's sports, which we hope, because they spend their whole lives crafting, or loving a sport, that maybe will turn into, whether that's coaching or administration or anything, managing any kind of or sport organization, but they're going to be leaders. And when they see women that look like them sitting in their shoes, now having, seeing them once a week, twice a week, 5 times a week, if you're maybe a, high level athlete, and having the opportunity now to be mentored, to see that role model, to know that whatever it is that they're doing, it's possible, that the examples that those women are given are living creatures. Like, I am in these shoes, I'm walking it, right? I don't actually have to point out and say, well, there is a woman somewhere around here that is doing it. Like, you are actually in that position. And I think there's no better example, for us to do that with the next generation of girls participating in sports. We can also talk a little bit about just body confidence and, period, things that we have experienced as women, that we have a lot more empathy, that we have a lot more understanding, than maybe our male counterparts might have not ever had been in that situation. So they're going to have to educate themselves. And if they're not educating themselves, they might be turning away some of the challenges that some of those girls that are participating in sports could have. So again, I go back to it. It's, if you can't see it, you can be it. And, that's just the best example that I can give.
That is absolutely true. Maria, you always tie right to my next question. You always set me up perfectly. So the next thing I wanted to ask Carolyn and Kat, thinking from an aspirational lens, this conversation goes down in history to spark the revolution. And looking forward 5-10 years from now, what do you hope to see? What changes are you hoping to see that will create a much more empowering experience for our women on and off the field?
Ooh, Kat, you want to go first?
Oh yeah. Okay. Only because I have to, my work is buzzing me nonstop. But more
Oh, no.
coaches that look like us with our backgrounds, coaching at high levels, at grassroots, at all levels, but in a way where they're also catering to their communities. I think that is lacking in the US specifically, that there's not a lot of chances, there's not enough coaching education courses that reflect on women from our communities. And I'm speaking on, like, for example, the Middle East and Central Asia community. I don't know many women from my part of the world that are coaches right now, but I do know a lot from, like, the Latin American. Slowly, the Black community is also gaining a lot of momentum in the soccer world. But if anyone who is here that you want to get involved on the coaching side, please contact me. I represent the Asian Pacific Islander coaches community at United Soccer Coaches, and I'm very well connected with the Black community as well. It's one of the largest communities under the United Soccer Coaches, and I'm more than happy to make that contact or that connection for you all. There's really good coaching courses and coaching tools out there that stem from very prestigious levels of coaching. I know that because I helped design it as well with my Black community counterparts. So please reach out to me if you would like to get involved. But we need more. Please do not stop. Please aspire to be a coach, because you have no idea who you are going to impact, because the next person you impact is going to impact another person. And then that's just the domino effect of how it works.
All right, I'm going to co-sign on to that. After you contact Coach Kat, contact me. I'm that person that helps to connect folks. I look at the beautiful sky of women of coaches in sporting spaces. I look at our connections, the constellations that we all exist in. I am that aspirational person that always looks up at the sky, and I always say it's really good. My orientation is to Black women in these spaces, to women of color in these spaces. So I have an easy answer for those of you who are asking those questions on how could we find each other, how can we help each other, how can we support each other. So I call that corporatizing sports, where we make it this easy, sort of accessible way to be with one another. And with that said, I'm on a whole bunch of, like, equity boards and initiatives and things like that. So I can point you to to give you some directional sort of guidance with there. And I know that that takes a lot of effort for us to research. It takes a lot of effort for us to Google it, to ask people, to find someone. And so if you really just contact me on social media. I'm pretty good at responding to folks, and I like that proximity. I think we are we can be a way that we can look at one another. I get myself to We Coach events. Maria knows this. I find myself in lots of spaces because I've learned from sports that I have to insert myself. That if I want to be the change that I want to see in this world, and right now I'm building out my sports in the future, how I want sports to look like in the future for my granddaughter. I have a granddaughter now, and she's going to have friends, and even her father, my son, still modeling this for everyone, that we are to look to women of color to continue this lineage of powerful organizing, of powerful taking up space. These spaces already do exist for us. We just have to avail ourselves to it.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank all of our distinguished panelists, Maria Lopez, Dr. Akila Carter-Francique, Coach Kat, and Carolyn Sadeko. I am so grateful that you joined us today and shared your expertise and all of your experiences. It has been illuminating and absolutely enjoyable to engage in these conversations. For all of our attendees, feel free to look in the chat as we are adding many places where you can learn more information about each of these ladies' work and how you can join into the ongoing work to support women of color in sports spaces. I'd like to thank you, both panelists and attendees, for joining us this March to highlight the importance of empowering women of color in coaching and leadership spaces. Today's webinar on championing diversity through sport illuminates that there is a glaring need for change. We've learned about personal journeys. We've discussed the importance of women of color in important roles for our women, our girls for the future. We've also discussed how the pivotal role plays in the lives of young athletes and how it helps them to develop into the women they can be. If you don't see it, you can't become it, as mentioned. And we can always go further as a team. So we're very excited for what comes next. I hope that everyone leaves the conversation inspired by the women on this webinar and by the stories that were shared. More importantly, I ask that you do not let this topic stay here. Take it to your community, to your teams, to your kitchen table, but take this conversation with you. Thank you for joining us today, and I wish you all a happy Women's History Month.